And as the campaign season heats up, President Biden and former President Trump are out there in person and online making their bid to voters. One highly sought after bloc, the youth vote, at one time in the bag for Biden, may be more elusive this year. A recent Harvard poll shows more than half of 18 to 29-year-olds surveyed said they will definitely vote in November. And a New York Times Siena poll of likely voters shows President Biden with a small 2-point lead over Trump in that age group. So next we're joined by Mike Leon to discuss. Mike's an NTD News contributor and the Director of Policy and Strategy at the Free and Equal Elections Foundation. Mike, good to see you again so soon. To start with, what do you think has contributed to this narrowing gap in the youth vote?
Steph, good to see you. That's right. Sooner better than later, right? Nobody better to talk about the youth vote than me, right? As a 42-year-old man. But the youth vote, and again, I've done some focus groups recently across a couple different radio stations with youth voters on the line as well for some of these shows. The biggest thing they point to, Steph, is always what is happening in Gaza. The war in Gaza right now has really taken center stage. We've seen it in the primaries with respect to the uncommitted vote in Michigan. We've seen it in other states as well. It's starting to rear its ugly head as President Biden is the only person from the Democratic side. At least he didn't have any real challengers other than obviously Representative Dean out of Minnesota and Marianne Williamson. But that uncommitted vote, these young voters are saying what is playing out in Gaza with respect to Israel and the war in Gaza is the biggest issue, and why young voters are thinking about maybe not even voting in the process. You know, in 2020, there was an 11-point increase in the youth vote, according to Tufts University, from 2016. And both of these guys are courting that youth vote. And right now, President Biden, unfortunately, has what's playing out in the Middle East as one of the big factors among youth voters as to why they're potentially either switching their vote or maybe not even voting at all.
Yeah, that's certainly on display at college campuses, and we do see it around the country right now as a top issue. That's, of course, drawing people away from, mostly drawing people away from, young people away from Biden at the moment. But the Republican Party is also implementing certain policies to try to draw them in. We've got, policies around TikTok, cryptocurrency, also tip taxation that all might benefit young people. How much do you think these policies are kind of drawing people in as opposed to repelling them from Biden?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Look, I think the biggest thing that I hear, again, when talking, doing these focus groups and talking to these voters, and Kevin just alluded to it just a second ago, the age of both of these men, right, is first and foremost, right, which is why at Free and Equal Elections Foundation, we're holding that debate. We're trying to get folks to realize that there are other candidates that are part of this race, the Libertarian candidate, Cornel West, RFK, et cetera, et cetera. But be that as it may, right now, these are the two choices that most people are going to focus in on. And we saw a low voter turnout in 2016. We saw a higher voter turnout in 2020. We could return back to that. To your policy question right now, I think both of them are starting to maybe send mixed signals around policies and not speaking directly to youth voters. But what they're trying to do is they're going to the places where youth voters are. So both of them are on TikTok, even though both administrations at one point tried to ban them, and Biden has banned it for federal employees. They're both going to where youth voters are. They're doing stuff with influencers. We just saw former President Trump do something with Logan Paul recently in an interview that got millions of views. So both of them are trying to meet voters where they are. But I don't know if the policy positions are going to hit with voters right now, Steph, because again, economic issues and foreign policy issues, most youth voters don't like either of these guys with respect to those topics.
So do you see this shift as being a somewhat lasting and not temporary, considering the fact that we're continuing in the same path in terms of international foreign relations at the moment?
Yeah, well, I think as more and more political orgs that you see out there try to encourage youth voters to go out there and vote, you mentioned the campus protest before. That's a way of engagement because people won't forget about that and what took place, during these spring and summer semesters, and maybe that'll carry over into the fall. But I think right now we're seeing more and more youth be more active about these policies, as you're seeing President Biden give these speeches and be interrupted by college protesters or at least protesters that are under the age of 30 years old, which factor into that youth vote. I think everyone's trying to garner it and they're trying to reach them where they are. The problem is right now, with respect to both former President Trump and current President Biden, age is a factor. And then what they're actually spitting out policy-wise in terms of how they would carry out measures from a foreign policy perspective, or even Trump from an economic perspective, I don't know if it's resonating right now with youth voters. But the key will be, we've got a debate coming up in 2 weeks, as you know, Steph.
Right.
So we'll get to see both of these folks outline it. And then we'll see what polling says after that, because we know people will be polling the youth vote after that to see what they lean.
What do you think they can do to win in this particular demographic? You know, for each side, what do you expect, and what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think you got to meet the issue head on, right? Like 81, 78, like those are the biggest issues. And then obviously the Trump administration, some of his tone and rhetoric on the immigration stuff, Biden administration on Israel and Gaza. You have to explain your platform and message. For Trump on the immigration front, we've seen immigration start to rise a little bit more nationally on voter issues. Explain what you would do with respect to the border. The president, current President Biden, has outlined certain measures that he would take. It just didn't get passed legislatively in D.C., and now he did the executive order. So for Trump, he needs to hammer home what specifically he would do on that front. For President Biden, the youth vote wants to know when Israel will stop bombing Gaza, when the hostages will be returned back. What is the solution? Is it a two-state solution, et cetera? The president has not been vocal, has not done a gaggle with press reporters to answer those type of questions. He's got to get in front of that, Steph, because this is the number one issue that they keep pointing to. Come November, they may not vote in or participate, and neither of them can afford to lose that.
And perhaps all of this will come out in the debate, as you mentioned, and we'll all be watching that closely, of course. Mike Leon, great to speak with you, as always.
Thanks, Steph.